When's the last time you groaned? Any groaners here? Well, sometimes when I have a day to work around the yard, I charge out to do the work like a 20-year-old. But by the end of the day, I'm groaning. Yes. I think you all groan too. It's a human thing to do, isn't it? Now, St. Paul, in last week's epistle reading and this week reading is talking about groaning as well. In fact, there's three groaners. There's creation that groans. There's us in the church who groans. And even the Holy Spirit groans, which tells me that even God is a groaner. Whoa, that's probably the first time you heard that, huh? Yeah, it's kind of like Russian nesting dolls. You've seen those, haven't you? Where you have a little doll that's solid, right? And often like a baby, and then somehow they build out of the same piece of wood a outer doll that fits over that, and then you keep on doing more and more and more dolls, and that's pretty much what we have here. At the center we have the Holy Spirit groaning, then the church, and on the outside we have creation groaning. And do you know what this tells us? That God is at the center of your pain. God is at the center of your pain. Let me start out with the outer doll, okay? The creation one. Creation groans. And we talked about this last week. The creation, thank God, God did not curse humanity, but he cursed creation with what a man had to deal with. And so whenever we look out in the creation, we see it, right? We feel it in the weeds and the thorns, the natural disasters, decay, and unsightly road kills, right? You see, creation is full of glory. The world is full of glory. We can see God's glory everywhere. But if we're honest, we see that there's a lot of decay and corruption. There's a lot of things about creation that we don't like. Very unpleasant things. And this takes us to, again, last week's reading. Let me just read it. Because the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning with labor pains together until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. But look at verse 22. Creation labors like a woman in labor. Now, I happen to know something about this because I remember when my wife was expecting her first child. We went and did the labor classes. I don't know if they do that now, but back in the 1990s, they did that. And of course, you'd see movies and you would have lectures and people talk to you about this is what you're supposed to do and the breathing and all sorts of stuff. That whole thing. And I did remember one thing. You're supposed to bring some reading material with you because it could be a long process. And I said, oh, okay, I can connect with that. So the day came and the contractions are happening and the groaning is starting to happen. But it's at intervals. And so what did I do? I took out my book to read. That was the wrong thing to do. My book said, you put that away. But I said, but they said I could bring it. It didn't work. Okay. So I never felt so absolutely and completely worthless when this whole thing's going on. I couldn't remember a thing that I was supposed to do, about the breathing and so on. And then I was beginning to think, You know, maybe they had it right in the good old days when the men were outside of this whole thing, period. But you know, finally, after gasps and groans, out came our little redheaded girl, you know, and we experienced glory. This is what Paul's talking about creation. When we see what's going on in creation, that is going bad, and it's groaning because it doesn't have the glory that it was first intended to have. He's saying these are just labor pains. It's going to birth out of the old. It's something going to be birthed, the new, the glory for which God intended it to have all along. So we have the outer shell, the outer doll of the Russian nesting dolls of creation. Now you take that one off, and within you find the church. The church groans within this creation. The church groans because she is both a child of heaven and a child of this present condition awaiting the adoption as sons. The glorification of our bodies, the wedding of heaven and on earth. But you know something? The church experiences pain differently than the world experiences it. Because, as we just read, the church experiences it with hope. The world doesn't have hope. It just groans and thinks this is all there is. But the church has hope. And what is more hopeful than an expectant mother? Now, my wife, Kathy, was never more happy when she was expecting. It happened twice in her life. She had a big smile and seemed to glow. I mean, ladies seem to look more beautiful, I think, whenever they're expecting. Why? It's because they're full of hope. To the world, the groaning is a hopeless dirge. And here, this strange little verse in the wisdom reading popped out to me. For you, he's talking about God, show your strength when men doubt the completeness of your power, and rebuke any insolence among those who know it. Now that's kind of hard to understand, but this is the way I interpret that. To the world, the bigger the suffering, the bigger the pain, the smaller God gets in their minds. But to the church, the greater the suffering, the bigger God seems, because we by faith know that God is bigger than our problems. Now you may say, Father John, how do you know this? How can this be? Well, if you take off the shell of the church, the Russian nesting doll of the church, and you take that one off, what do you have inside? You have the Holy Spirit groaning. And I want to read that again because it's so important for us today. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with sighs too deep, groanings, that's what, same word, groaning, too deep for words. And he who searches the hearts of men knows what is in the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. Now, the Holy Spirit is most interior. He's at the heart of all groaning. And this takes me to Colossians chapter 1:17, which is such an important verse because we read there that Christ, through the Holy Spirit, is the one that upholds all things. Everything in this world, Christ is there. Christ is a historical Christ, but he's also what we might call a cosmic Christ. How can it be both things? It's a mystery. But Christ upholds all things. Can you imagine that Christ and the Holy Spirit, because the two are in union, from the beginning of time, has been intimate and knowledgeable about every single terrible thing that's ever happened to anybody, in every place and in every time. Wow. God feels the fullness of human pain and suffering. Now, we can always understand that God could be behind, let's say, a beautiful flower and say, wow, Christ is in here. The fair things. But what about all the foul things? We don't think of that too much, do we? And our suffering, as real as it is, when you think about it, is but a sliver of the whole that God experiences. The Spirit knows we cannot grasp the horrors that we experience. Our minds are not profound enough to probe the depths of suffering and our human condition. But the Holy Spirit groans within us. And if we're not in touch with the Holy Spirit groaning within us, then we feel alone in our sufferings, don't we? But if we are in touch, then we are in union with God. And we end up not praying so much to God, but praying with God. And there's a big difference. Matter of fact, in conclusion, I just want to read this to you. A theologian visited the papal chapel where Pope John Paul was celebrating, or was hearing Mass. As we entered the small chapel, the Pope was already there, kneeling in personal prayer, as he usually was before Mass. But this time, there was a difference. Audible groans were coming from the Pope as he prayed, and they continued during Mass as the readings were read, as communion was distributed. And I knew it wasn't simply that the Pope had physical or spiritual suffering to contend with, although he certainly did, but that we were experiencing that prayer of St. Paul speaks about in Romans 8, where the Spirit helps us pray in groans and sighs too deep for words. One day, someone asked Pope John Paul II, how does the Pope pray? To which he answered, you would have to ask the Holy Spirit. The Pope prays as the Holy Spirit permits him to pray. Whoa. That's an example of being in touch with our inner core, the Holy Spirit who groans within us, who helps us to sort out things that we're too confused about. And so today we have a cosmology. Okay, a cosmology is a way of looking at how the world fits together. And there are different ways of looking at cosmology, but here it is a cosmology through suffering. Okay? The whole world fits together. And it helps us to make sense of suffering. From the core, which is the Holy Spirit, to we as the church, and to the whole world. So, the next time you groan, which will probably be pretty soon, right? Remember that you're not alone.